Tilley sat in the cockpit, her hands moving instinctively across the controls as the deep hum of the engine vibrated through her small, sleek ship. She had always been proud to serve her people, the Liraki, a race of pacifists and scholars, dedicated to understanding the universe without disturbing its balance. But today, her mission had nothing to do with peaceful exploration. It was reconnaissance. Covert and dangerous. Far from the diplomatic tasks her kind usually embraced. This wasn't a mission she had sought out, no one wanted to encounter humans. The ship's sensors pulsed rhythmically as they scanned the atmosphere, searching for traces of the Vrigari. Tilley's heart raced slightly faster than usual. Not because of the Vrigari, they were a known threat. No, it was the distant but real possibility of encountering humans, the bloodthirsty species that had carved out a reputation of fear in every corner of the galaxy. Her people told stories about them, stories that made young Liraki children shudder, savage, warmongering beasts, driven by conquest and carnage. And yet, here she was, on the very edge of human space. Tilley's thoughts drifted to the countless tales she had heard about humans, particularly one human soldier, Jax. His name was synonymous with ruthlessness. He was said to be the perfect example of what made humans so terrifying, a calculating, relentless warrior who would stop at nothing to crush his enemies. Even thinking his name sent a shiver down her spine. Her hands tightened on the controls as she silently hoped she would never cross paths with him, or any of his kind. Suddenly, a sharp warning sound blared through the cockpit, snapping her back to the present. The control panel flickered, and before she could react, the ship lurched violently. The steady hum of the engine turned into a deafening roar. Systems were failing, quickly. She slammed her hand against the emergency override, her voice barely above a whisper as she muttered a prayer. But the ship wasn't responding. Come on, come on! She gritted through her teeth, trying to maintain control as the planet below pulled her into its gravity well. Alarms echoed around her, her ship plummeting through the atmosphere, shaking violently. She wasn't going to make it to the surface intact. With a deafening crash, the ship hit the ground, metal twisting and screeching as it skidded across the rocky terrain before finally coming to a halt. Silence followed. Tilley blinked, her vision blurry. Her head pounded, and a sharp pain throbbed in her side. She tried to move, but her muscles felt heavy, and her breath came in shallow, painful gasps. Her cockpit was a ruin, cracks spidering through the viewscreen, smoke curling in from damaged systems. Panic began to claw at her chest. She needed to move. The Vrigari would have seen the crash. They were opportunistic, cruel. If they found her alive, they wouldn't leave her that way for long. With a wince, Tilley forced herself to unbuckle and crawl out of the wreckage, her limbs trembling as she stumbled onto the planet's surface. The air was thick, humid, and oppressive. Large, jagged rocks and craters stretched out as far as she could see, creating a desolate, hostile landscape. Her eyes darted across the horizon. No immediate sign of the Vrigari yet, but it wouldn't be long before they arrived. She cursed under her breath. She was injured, alone, and vulnerable, exactly the kind of prey they relished. As she limped away from the crash site, her thoughts kept circling back to her people. The Liraki were not built for violence. They avoided confrontation, used diplomacy where others used weapons. But here, in this hostile environment, diplomacy would do nothing for her. She had no illusions about her fate if the Vrigari found her. They were brutal and merciless, but at least they were a known evil. But if the humans came... Her steps faltered as her mind betrayed her with another image, the humans. She had seen images of their warships, their heavy armor, and their savage eyes, cold and unfeeling, like predators surveying their prey. The thought alone made her stomach turn. A distant sound snapped her attention forward. The air shifted. She instinctively ducked behind a rock, her heart hammering in her chest. The Vrigari. She could hear the clink of their armor, their guttural voices carrying over the wind. They were close, too close. Tilley's pulse quickened as she pressed herself against the rock, willing herself to disappear. The Vrigari were talking, but she couldn't make out the words. There were at least 3 of them, and they were spreading out, scanning the area. They had found the wreckage, she realized. She had only minutes, maybe less, before they found her too. Her body trembled, both from pain and fear. She could barely think through the haze of panic clouding her mind. This was it. She was going to die here. A useless death, alone on a barren rock, killed by creatures she had never wanted to face. Just as despair began to creep in, something else stirred in the distance. Another sound, different from the Vergari's guttural voices. A low, rumbling hum, growing louder. It wasn't the Vergari. Her heart froze in her chest. A shadow moved swiftly between the rocks. It was large, quick. For a second, she thought it was another Vergari, but as the figure drew closer, her breath caught. It was human. The figure moved with terrifying precision, a blur of strength and purpose. Tilly barely dared to breathe as she watched from her hiding spot, her mind struggling to process what she was seeing. He was armored, tall, and moved like a predator. But there was no mistaking him. This was a human soldier. Her worst nightmare had just materialized in front of her. The Vergari, too, had noticed the human now. One of them raised his weapon, barking a command in their guttural tongue. But before the alien could even aim, the human was on him, a swift, brutal strike sending the Vergari crashing to the ground. Another Vergari lunged, but the human dispatched him with cold efficiency. Tilly felt her body go cold. The stories were true. Humans were ruthless killers. She squeezed her eyes shut, heart pounding in her ears. This was it. She was going to die, just like the Vergari. The human would find her, and he wouldn't hesitate. Seconds passed. Then silence. She cracked one eye open, unable to resist the pull of curiosity. The human stood amidst the fallen Vergari, his back to her. He hadn't noticed her yet. She pressed herself harder against the rock, praying he wouldn't turn around. But then he did. And his eyes locked onto hers. Her breath caught in her throat. He didn't raise his weapon. Didn't charge at her. He just looked. Tilly's mind was a mess of confusion. Why hadn't he attacked? She expected to see coldness in his eyes, but instead there was something else, something she didn't understand. The human soldier, Jax, she realized, though it made no sense, approached slowly, his gaze scanning her injuries. He knelt beside her, his movements deliberate, methodical, but not cruel. She flinched, expecting pain, but instead, he reached for his medkit. Tilly stared, unable to comprehend what was happening. Tilly could barely breathe, her body pinned against the jagged rock, the harsh laughter of the Vergari filling the air as they closed in. Her mind screamed for her to move, to fight, but her injuries made her weak, useless. One of the scouts stepped forward, his weapon raised, and she could see the cruel glint in his eyes. This was the end. The thought barely settled in her mind when a blur of movement cut through the corner of her vision. There was no time to react. In an instant, the Vergari who had been laughing moments earlier crumpled to the ground, lifeless. The remaining scouts froze, confusion flashing across their faces, before they too were taken down, one by one, with swift, brutal efficiency. Tilly's mind raced, her heart pounding in her chest. She barely understood what had just happened. All she could see was the figure standing among the fallen Vergari, towering over them, battle-hardened and armed. The human. Her blood ran cold. It wasn't just any human, it was him. Jax. The name that haunted Liraki history, spoken in whispers among her people as the prime example of human cruelty. She felt her limbs go rigid, her instincts screaming to run, but she couldn't move. Couldn't breathe. All the tales she had heard about him flooded her thoughts. Ruthless, unstoppable, a living weapon. Her hands clenched into fists, expecting him to turn on her at any moment. But he didn't. Jax's eyes swept over her, assessing the situation with cold precision. She stared, terrified, waiting for him to act. The Vergari were dead, but her fate was still uncertain. Humans didn't spare anyone, especially not enemies, and she was very much alone. She squeezed her eyes shut, bracing for the worst. When nothing happened, she cautiously opened them. Jax was kneeling beside her now, pulling out a medkit, his expression unreadable. Her mind struggled to process the scene before her. He was helping her? Why? She flinched as he reached for her arm, but his movements were deliberate and practiced, not unkind. He began patching up her wounds, his hands working quickly and efficiently, but there was no gentleness, no comfort in his actions. He was focused, and for a moment she wondered if he even saw her as anything more than another mission objective. Tille's breath came in shaky bursts as she watched him, her mind spinning. This couldn't be real. Jax wasn't supposed to help anyone, especially not an alien like her. Humans were supposed to be ruthless, killing machines. Her people's teachings played on repeat in her head, but everything she was experiencing contradicted that. Her world had painted humans in one stark image, and now that image was crumbling right before her eyes. He didn't speak, didn't offer any explanation for why he was helping her. His face remained impassive as he worked. It was as if this was nothing more than routine for him, patching up a wounded ally, even if that ally was from a race his kind had long been at odds with. Her confusion only deepened as the minutes passed. Jax finally finished tending to her wounds, securing the last bandage with practiced ease. Tille hadn't said a word, too stunned to even form coherent thoughts, let alone sentences. She had expected death, and instead, she was alive, thanks to the very creature her people feared the most. The contradictions were too much to untangle in the moment, and her mind felt like it was spinning out of control. Before she could find her voice, the sharp sound of footsteps echoed in the distance. More Vergari. Tille's heart jumped in her throat. They were coming fast, and in her condition, she wouldn't stand a chance against them. Panic set in again, but this time, Jax was already moving. Without a word, he pulled her to her feet, his grip firm but not rough. Tille winced from the pain in her side but forced herself to stand. She didn't understand why he was doing this, why he wasn't abandoning her, but she was too weak and too frightened to resist. More enemies were coming, and she couldn't afford to question his motives right now. "We need to move," Jax said finally, his voice low but commanding. It was the first time he had spoken, and the sound of it sent a shiver down her spine. There was no warmth there, but there was also no malice. It was just efficient. Like everything else about him. Tille swallowed hard, her thoughts a tangled mess of fear, confusion, and disbelief. She had no choice but to follow him now. Tille limped along beside Jax, her body protesting every step, the oppressive landscape stretching endlessly ahead. They had been moving for what felt like hours, the threat of the Vergari still hanging over them like a shadow. The terrain was unforgiving, jagged rocks and sudden drops making their journey even more difficult. But Jax moved with an effortless precision, scanning their surroundings constantly, his every movement calculated. He never looked back at her, but somehow, he always seemed to know when she needed a moment to catch her breath. Despite her fear and the pain that radiated through her body, Tille couldn't help but notice how different he was from the image her people had of humans. Jax was a soldier, that much was clear, but there was something more. There was a discipline in his movements, a sense of control. He wasn't the chaotic, bloodthirsty creature she had been taught to expect. He was methodical, almost protective, though he never spoke of it. She found herself watching him more closely, trying to understand him. Her fear hadn't disappeared, it still gripped her whenever his gaze flickered toward her. But now, there was something else. Curiosity. This wasn't the monster she had been raised to fear, and that unsettled her more than anything. Jax was silent as they moved, his focus entirely on survival, but his actions spoke louder than words. He made sure she kept pace, even when her injuries slowed her down. When they stopped briefly to rest, he handed her water without a word. When night fell, he found a sheltered spot and set up a perimeter, always maintaining that silent vigilance. It was as if protecting her was just another part of his routine, something he did without question. Tille's mind churned with confusion. None of this made sense. Why would a human, especially one like Jax, care whether she lived or died? Her people had always said humans were ruthless, only concerned with their own survival and victory. But here was this man, ensuring her safety at every turn, while saying almost nothing. It was disorienting. As they settled for the night, the silence between them stretched, heavy with unspoken thoughts. She wanted to ask him, to demand why he was helping her, but the words wouldn't come. Instead, she found herself blurting out something entirely different. "My people think you're monsters," she said quietly, her voice barely above a whisper. Jax glanced at her, his expression unreadable in the dim light. He didn't respond right away, just stared at her, as if considering whether it was worth his time to answer. Finally, he spoke, his voice flat and dry. "Wouldn't be the first time I've heard that." She swallowed hard, her fingers twisting in her lap. His words stung, but there was no anger behind them, only resignation. It was as if he was used to being seen that way, and it no longer affected him. Still, she pressed on, unable to stop herself. "Is it true?" she asked. "Are you what they say?" He didn't answer right away, his gaze flickering to the horizon as if searching for something far beyond their immediate surroundings. When he finally spoke, his tone was darker, edged with a weariness that Tilley hadn't expected. "I've done things," Jax said, his voice low. "Things that your people would call monstrous. Things my own people call necessary." Tilley felt a chill run down her spine, but she didn't pull away. There was something in the way he said it, a heaviness to his words that made her want to understand more, even though she knew she shouldn't. She had been taught that humans were nothing but killers, but Jax was far more complicated than that. She could see it now. "Why?" she asked, her voice softer now, her fears slowly giving way to genuine curiosity. Jax hesitated, his jaw tightening as if the memories were painful to summon. "Because it's what I had to do. To survive. To protect my own. We're not all monsters, but in war, you do what you have to." His gaze hardened as he met her eyes. "Doesn't mean I enjoy it." His words hung in the air, and for the first time, Tilley saw something deeper in him, a weariness that came from more than just fighting. It was the weight of loss, of choices made long ago that couldn't be undone. Her chest tightened as she realized how much of her own perception had been shaped by stories, by fear. Maybe, just maybe, her people had been wrong. But before she could think further, a distant sound echoed through the rocks, a familiar, ominous clinking of Rigari weapons. Tilley froze, her heart hammering in her chest. They had found them. She could feel the tension radiating from Jax as he stood, his hand already on his weapon. The danger was real, and they were running out of time. Jax looked at her, his expression unreadable once more, but there was no hesitation in his movements. He handed her a small blade, a silent command that spoke volumes. If they were going to survive this, they would need to trust each other, whether or not they understood one another. Tilley's grip tightened around the weapon, her mind spinning with everything that had just happened. She still didn't fully trust him, how could she? But the weight of the blade in her hand felt oddly reassuring. It was a reminder that, for now, they were allies in this fight. The Rigari were getting closer, their guttural voices growing louder. Tilley felt her pulse quicken as she looked at Jax. There was no fear in his eyes, only determination. He was ready for the fight ahead, and now, so was she. For the first time since the crash, she wasn't running from him. The air was thick with tension as Jax and Tilley crouched behind the rocks, Rigari voices growing louder, closer. Tilley could feel her pulse pounding in her ears, her body still weak from her injuries. She glanced at Jax, who was already preparing for the inevitable fight. There was a sharp focus in his eyes, a determination that made it clear he had been in these situations before. He looked at her once, then handed her a second weapon. No words, just a look that said everything. * You're part of this now. *. Tilley's fingers tightened around the handle. She didn't want to fight, didn't know if she even could in her current state. But the choice had been taken from her. The Rigari were here, and survival depended on her working with him. She swallowed her doubts and prepared herself, trying to steady her hands. The Rigari attacked swiftly, their guttural battle cries tearing through the air. Jax was on them before they could fully close in, his movements fluid, precise. Tilly watched in awe and terror as he fought, his sheer efficiency both intimidating and mesmerizing. Every strike was lethal, every movement calculated. This was what her people had feared, what they had warned her about. A human in battle was a force of nature. But what shook her the most was how he fought. It wasn't driven by rage or bloodlust. There was no cruelty in his actions. He was protecting them both, but especially her. When one Vrigari broke through and lunged toward her, she froze, expecting the worst. But Jax was there, taking the hit meant for her and countering with a fierce blow that sent the Vrigari crashing to the ground. Tilly's hands shook as she tried to fight off another attacker, her movements clumsy at first. But then instinct took over. She blocked, swung, and for the first time, she felt a flicker of control. Beside her, Jax moved like a storm, relentless but not reckless. Every time a Vrigari came too close to her, he was there, deflecting attacks and drawing their focus away from her. He wasn't fighting for himself. He was fighting for both of them. The battle raged on, the brutal reality of it crashing into Tilly's senses. Her muscles burned, her breath came in ragged gasps, and the metallic scent of blood filled the air. Yet despite everything, they worked together, an unexpected synchronization in their movements. Jax was strong, yes, but he also fought with a care she hadn't expected, a focus on keeping her alive even when it put him at risk. The final Vrigari fell, a sharp cry signaling the end of the ambush. Tilly stumbled backward, her limbs trembling, chest heaving with exhaustion. It was over. They had survived. She stared at the bodies scattered around them, her mind reeling from the chaos that had just unfolded. But instead of feeling triumph or relief, all she could think about was Jax. She turned to him, her breath catching in her throat. He stood a few feet away, his body covered in fresh cuts and bruises, his stance steady but clearly strained. Blood seeped from a deep wound on his side, his face tight with pain, though he still hadn't acknowledged it. He was watching her, his gaze steady, waiting for her to react. And that's when it hit her. Everything her people had told her about humans, about their cruelty, their thirst for violence, it wasn't true. Not entirely. Yes, Jax was a fighter, a killer even, but it wasn't out of bloodlust. It was out of necessity. Out of duty. And in that moment, as the adrenaline began to fade and the reality of their situation settled in, Tilly realized just how wrong she had been. Jax wasn't a monster. He had every reason to let her die, to leave her to fend for herself, but he hadn't. He had fought for her, protected her, even though she was nothing more than an alien to him. He wasn't driven by the cruelty her people had feared, he was driven by something much deeper. Tilly's entire worldview began to shift. She had been raised to believe that humans were nothing but dangerous, violent creatures. But here, standing in front of her, was a man who had risked his life to save hers. A man who, in the midst of battle, had shown her more compassion than she had ever expected from his kind. Her thoughts were interrupted by a sudden stagger from Jax. His face paled, and he stumbled, catching himself on a rock. The wound in his side was worse than she had thought. Blood was pooling at his feet, his breaths coming in sharp, shallow bursts. Panic gripped her chest as she rushed to his side, her hands shaking as she tried to assess the damage. Jax gritted his teeth, trying to wave her off. "It's nothing," he muttered, though the strain in his voice betrayed the truth. He was hurt. Badly. Tilly's heart pounded as she knelt beside him, frantically searching for a way to stop the bleeding. She didn't know much about human physiology, but the basics were the same for most species. Pressure. Keep the wound closed. Stop the bleeding. For the first time since the crash, Tilly found herself in a position of power. Jax had saved her life more than once, and now it was her turn. She could leave him, walk away, and no one would ever know. But as she pressed down on his wound, trying to slow the bleeding, she knew she couldn't. She wouldn't. Jax was staring at her, his expression hard to read. Maybe he was waiting for her to make that choice, to abandon him. But Tilly didn't flinch. She was done seeing him as an enemy. Done believing the lies her people had told her about humans. She worked quickly, tearing strips of fabric from her clothes to wrap around his side, her hands moving with a sense of urgency. Jax grunted in pain but didn't stop her. His breathing was ragged, his strength fading, but he didn't resist. As she finished, Tilly sat back, her eyes meeting his. There was no anger in his gaze, no accusation. Just exhaustion. He didn't say anything, and neither did she. But in that silence, something had changed between them. She wasn't sure what would happen next. The Vrigari were still out there, and they were far from safety. But as Jax leaned back, trying to catch his breath, Tilly knew one thing for certain. She couldn't leave him. Not after everything. Tilly's hands moved quickly, her focus entirely on stopping the bleeding and stabilizing Jax. The medkit he had used to save her earlier was now in her grasp, and she applied the same calm efficiency he had shown when tending to her injuries. As she worked, she couldn't shake the irony of it, her tending to the wounds of the human she had once feared more than death itself. The idea seemed absurd now. Jax had risked everything to save her, again and again. He had fought for her, protected her, and despite the horrors of the battle they had just survived, she could no longer see him as the monster she had been taught to fear. The stories, the fear-mongering, the deep-seated belief that humans were nothing but destroyers, it all felt distant now, like a bad dream she had woken from. The truth was far more complicated. As she tightened the bandages around Jax's side, her mind whirled. There was no denying that humans were capable of violence, she had seen it with her own eyes. But it wasn't senseless or cruel. It was calculated, purposeful, and in Jax's case, it was motivated by something deeper. He hadn't fought for glory or conquest. He had fought because it was necessary. Because, in his own way, he was protecting her, someone he had no reason to protect. The pain in her side flared, but she pushed it aside, her focus never wavering from Jax. The blood had slowed, but the wound was deep. She wasn't sure if her patch job would hold long enough for them to find real help, but she had done what she could. As she finished, she sat back on her heels, her breath coming in steady, measured beats. Jax was unconscious, his body heavy with exhaustion, but his breathing had stabilized. She found herself watching him, wondering how someone so dangerous could also be capable of such restraint and care. How had she been so wrong about humans? Could her entire species have been? The silence stretched around them, but her thoughts were far from quiet. For her entire life, humans had been painted as the villains of the galaxy. But now, after everything she had been through, after seeing Jax's actions and choices, she wasn't sure what to believe anymore. The truth was, she had seen more humanity in Jax than she ever expected. He was complex, more than just a soldier. He was loyal, dedicated, and perhaps most surprising of all, compassionate. The cold, bloodthirsty monster her people had warned her about had never materialized. Instead, he had saved her life, repeatedly, and asked for nothing in return. Jax stirred, his face twisting with pain as he slowly regained consciousness. Tilly held her breath, waiting. His eyes flickered open, and for a moment, they were clouded with confusion. But then he saw her, and recognition settled in. His gaze shifted to his bandaged side, and then back to her, a flicker of surprise crossing his features. "You didn't leave," he muttered, his voice rough, laced with fatigue. It wasn't a question, more of a statement, but the disbelief was clear. Tilly shook her head. "I couldn't." He gave a short, dry laugh, but winced as the pain caught up to him. "Most would have." "I'm not most," she said quietly, her eyes meeting his. There was a moment of silence between them, heavy with meaning. Jax studied her, his gaze lingering, as if he were trying to understand why she had stayed. Why she had saved him. After everything they had been through, the battles, the bloodshed, the terror, she wasn't supposed to be here, helping him. "Why?" he asked finally, the word barely more than a whisper. "Why did you save me?" Tilly didn't answer right away. She didn't need to think about it. The answer was already clear in her mind. But saying it out loud was another matter entirely. Admitting that she had been wrong about humans, about Jax, about everything, it wasn't easy. But she had to. Because I see you now, she said softly, her voice steady. I see who you really are. And you're not a monster. You never were. Jack stared at her, the weight of her words hanging between them. He didn't argue, didn't deny what she had said. For the first time, there was no tension between them. Just understanding. Tilly looked away, her mind racing again. What would happen now? She had a choice to make. She could return to her people and tell them the truth about humans, about Jax. But would they believe her? Would they accept that the stories they had been told for generations were wrong? That humans weren't the heartless killers they had been led to believe? Or she could say nothing. She could return to her life, to the safety of her world, and keep the truth to herself. But the thought of doing that left a bitter taste in her mouth. After everything Jax had done, after everything she had seen, how could she go back to believing the same lies? Jax shifted, wincing slightly, but his gaze never left her. What now? He asked, his voice low but steady. Tilly didn't have an answer. The future was uncertain. The Vergari were still a threat, and her people were still living in fear of the humans. But she couldn't ignore what she had learned, what she had seen with her own eyes. Humans weren't the simple villains her people had made them out to be. They were capable of violence, yes, but also of compassion. Of loyalty. Of something deeper. I don't know, she admitted, her voice soft but honest. But I can't go back to the way things were. Not after this. Jax nodded, as if he understood. There was no more need for words. The bond between them, forged in battle and blood, was something neither of them could fully explain, but it was real. It had changed them both. As they prepared to move, Tilly felt a strange sense of hope. The future was uncertain, but maybe that wasn't such a bad thing. Maybe, just maybe, this was the start of something new. Something better. She looked at Jax one last time, knowing that whatever came next, she wouldn't face it with the same fear she once had. The truth was out there now, and it was up to her to decide what to do with it. For the first time since this journey began, the future didn't seem so frightening.